Okay, hello and welcome again to 365 Days to Racial Change. My name is Tomlins Nyback, and I'm going to get right to it because we got a lot of stuff to get to. Of course, we're continuing in our series about slave restriction, black codes that went on in the North and South through about the 1600s and late into the 1800s. Before we get too far into that, I want to say I'm informed. We are informed in this community by a man named Dr. Claude Anderson, who's written a handful of very great books, three of which we reference extensively here at 365 Days Towards Racial Change. I got to shorten that one of these days, but it suffices for now. Anyway, his first book, A Black History Reader, 101 Questions You Never Thought to Ask. I want you to get these books so that you can read for yourself, so you know I'm not misinterpreting the information or things like that. But that was a great read, very eye-opening about slave culture in the United States. Does it prevail today? I'm going to touch on that just for a minute or so in a moment. Also, Black Labor, White Wealth, Search for Economic Justice in America. Very important work. That's what we are referencing these past few days. So please get that work. And finally, Powernomics, his national plan to empower Black America. And very great work, gives a lot of ideas. Unfortunately, I'm coming to the conversation and to the seriousness of the Black community very late. He wanted to see some things transpire by 2005. I'm not sure if that happened because of where I'm situated socially in America. But as I get into this information and actually broach some other communities, specifically Dr. Boyce Watkins and his work with business, finance, things like that, empowering Black America economically, specifically, and then I get to hear and see that, yes, Black people just aren't as jammed up as I am. I'll put it as short. Two more references: Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, white female abolitionist. So it's not all humdrum and lynching, murders, and poisoning, crop burning, economic sequestering and quarantine for Black folks, right? Very positive outcome, right, here at 365 days. But we're going to look at some fictional accounts here. Uncle Tom's Cabin, very influential in American relationships between white and Black and stereotypes, and you're going to see that it's very prominent here in America. And finally, behind me, hashtag #US2 community, hashtag USTOO, and you'll find even more people. There's also another website called Black Enough. Don't ask me to spell it. It doesn't spell like it sounds, but you'll find it easy if you just Google that. All right, let's get right into it. My first concerns also, as always, with this series, this week or so that we've been talking about these Black codes and restrictions, Northern restrictions and codes and things like that, is does the slave mind, does white entitlement and empowerment, Black vulnerability, mindset still exist in America? Are these codes a source of some of these stereotypes and mindsets that we see that may prevail in the nation? I have my views. I try not to be too specific. I don't want to handhold you, and so you say that Tomlins Nyback says such and such. I want to just present information, and you use some critical thinking skills to see where you might fit, what decisions you may make based on the evidence there. You be like a judge and jury of the evidence I present to you here. My concern is about blacks not playing the American game rightly as a group, as a nation. I want to see more critical thinking. I want to look beyond, underneath some of these conversations, and look at the concepts that made this constructs that may still be existing in America. We talked about social construct. I'll be visiting that idea uh, occasionally through this year. And finally, I realized, I was talking about Warren Buffett, and I hope if he ever hears those comments that he doesn't take them personally. I'm talking about economic, where the money's going economically, how it's situated, how it's nested in white power, how it accumulates exponentially, how it draws from black labor and things like that. I'm studying a lot of finance and investments right now. Of course, when we talk about that, especially in the 21st century, you can't get around hearing about Warren Buffett, but I'm not attacking him personally. I'm just, I, you know, I want, when we talk about economics and money, we want to know the roots of some of the success. White success comes from free labor and from black Americans, free land from the Native Americans, and those money, the resources are sequestered, and they've been gained through slavery, violent means, exclusion, sequesters, quarantines, things like that. Now, Mr. Buffett may not have been like directly involved in any of that, but he's definitely a beneficiary of that. I say all that to say that now, as I look into finances, investments, and things like that, that I see my little kernel, my little sand on the beach, gaining some momentum, gaining value. I need to realize that now I'm participating in America, but I'm participating rightly. This goes back to how black Americans are playing the game in America. As a group, whites, Asians, Hispanics, all really laid out much better by Dr. Anderson, and his work is better articulated by him, but we're not playing rightly as a group. We're spending our disposable income. That's income is supposed to work for us. We can live and enjoy life on much less, but we can put that money in places where it can multiply, where it can work for us, where as we sleep, money is being made. Now, I don't have a giant investment portfolio that I can quit my day job and all that, but it's nice to know, man, I went to sleep and some action or politics or economic movement on the planet netted me some of that income. I own companies now. I'm properly oriented economically. I may not be where I want there yet, but at least I am participating rightly, and I want Black Americans to do that. Let's jump into the codes. Maybe I'll do a piece. We got a lot of days to go. We're not even out of the first 30 days yet of 365 days towards racial change. So we got a long way to go. So I'm on page 237, Black Labor, White Wealth, and we're back there in the appendix talking about all these things. So, and as I'm just going to fly by. I want to speak. I'm speaking fast because a lot of things jumped out to me, and I got to bring in some other resources to make sense of some of the things that appear in Dr. Anderson's account here. It's chronological, and these are the southern states' restrictions and codes. First is we want to talk about 1848 Virginia incitement law. It provided a death penalty for advising slaves to rebel. emancipation and abolitionist thinking and rhetoric, slave rhetoric, Masters is probably heating up. In a few years, in another decade or so, there's going to be war on the issue. And, you know, if the North had airplanes, they'd be throwing pamphlets out and stuff to, you know, educate and encourage blacks to break free, you know, from their slave masters. We're going to get down more into it, but I want you to get this. I want to say this first, right up kind of on the top. I'm going to reiterate it, but Emancipation of Proclamation, Civil War was not a moral move, altruistic move by white people to free blacks. It was an economic and political engagement that that happened there with the Civil War and all that. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute, but I want to just put that seed out there initially. 1850 Fugitive Slave Act law enacted. Anyway, stronger enforcement and provisions. Okay, no, you know. Okay, now let's ramp up. Let's make it more scary to engage in escaping and helping and aiding fugitives. 1852, Georgia tax law imposed annual $5 per capita tax on free blacks. $5 a year. That's a lot of money. These little, we make none of them. I'll give you $5. Just leave me alone. But back then, that's a lot of money, especially if the black has no income. If his whole existence is simply existing on a piece of land that he's hoping him and his family will plant enough food and the animals stay alive to get them through the year, and especially a hard winter. So that tax law could be very demanding on blacks. 1853 Virginia poll tax law levy tax on all free black males 21 to 55 years old. There's no escape, you know. Free labor maybe is dwindling then at that point. Oh man, let's just impose another tax is their solution. Remember, the blacks weren't. This was not a debate. Blacks weren't at the state legislation opposing this or even giving any input. This is done in the absence of any black involvement. These are just white people sitting around making up stuff. 1856 Virginia drug law forbade selling poisonous drugs to blacks. And I want to talk just a little bit about this. This could have an agricultural impact, especially maybe in the area of pesticides. I have not done any huge research. I'm just brainstorming a lot of this stuff, but you know, could impact pesticides if you know if that was a part of the agricultural climate at that time. Also, you don't want blacks having poison because white men who may be jealous of black success in agriculture frequently would burn crops, poison animals. Great scene in Mississippi movie, Mississippi Burning, has Gene Hackman talking about his father, his character's father, doing that kind of thing to a black man who owned a mule and stuff like that. There's documentation of black men owning cars, vehicles, being shot dead on the street, broad daylight, things like that. No charges ever levied or filed like that. So, you know, the successful black man was a target for poisonings and things like that, and the white establishment didn't want blacks to have access to those kind of poisonous materials probably frowned on them having firearms and being armed as well. We talked about some of that, about the Second Amendment, if you remember that discussion. So that's an important point there. Tensions are brewing. It's 1856, and the issue, war may be whispered, and words used in some of the rhetoric and dialogue amongst North and South, as tensions are growing at this point. Now, 1857 Dred Scott decision, where the Supreme Court dehumanized and disenfranchised blacks. I'm going to refer to a Black history reader here and quote the Supreme Court's decision. It says, a black man would have no rights that a white man is bound to respect. Now, this came from this slave, Dred Scott, and although I don't think that was his real name, was with his master, went from his slave state to a free state and returned, and Dred Scott argued that he was free because he had left that slave state, the slave's territory. Now, what's surprising to me that a black man's issue had reached the Supreme Court. No doubt he had a lot of help. So I do want to, give a shout out and occasionally, reiterate that not all people in competition with blacks, or not all people noted as being in competition with blacks, are at odds with blacks. I have plenty of white friends. I'm a friendly guy, I can kind of gauge. We're just talking about overall communities and their involvements and how blacks are treated as a group, by whites as a group, by Asians as a group, as Hispanics as a group in general. But not all people on all sides are one way or the other. We're talking about human beings here. Okay, so this Dred Scott decision that white men will not respect black interests, and we see that today. I see it, but I dare not call police anymore because they just don't care. When they show up, they take a look at me, and it's like I'm being uppity, and I pull them away from their coffee and donuts, and I'm being an irritation to them is kind of how I feel. So I'm very wary of getting law enforcement involved. Something really has to be really seriously happening, of which I'm not involved, for me to call some kind of official help. Okay, now with that Dred Scott decision, we move further into 1858, a year later. Maryland's recreation law forbade free blacks and slaves from boating on the Potomac. It's probably an issue of resources. If there's fishing there, I don't know if there's any business economics there on the Potomac. Things like that. Also, Maryland, Kentucky, some of that north-south line. They're probably trying to impede the Underground Railroad and things like that. So there's a lot of, I'm sure, white reasons to keep blacks off of the water there in the Potomac. And okay, now this isn't in his book, but I like history to make sense and have everything filled in. Since I broached Dr. Anderson's work, I've seen he's filled in a lot of historical gaps for me. I've said before how white history is like fireworks. Boom, there's the Wright brothers. Boom, there's Thomas Edison. It's always these great big happenings in the world, but we don't see what's underlying and supporting a lot of these great events, great white events, and most of it we can fill in the missing parts of that with black slave labor, and we could talk about the Native Americans being disenfranchised with their land as well. So with that, I need to inject the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, has kicked off and is now underway as we finish a few last segments of his historical list, Dr. Anderson's list. And with that, in the middle of the war, here comes Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And it's not the first, kind of civil rights law that occurs, but it happens. You need to understand. It's like I said, that the emancipation or freedom of slaves. First off, it was only for slaves. It was only given rights to slaves in the southern states. It wasn't like it's an Emancipation Proclamation, and we assume slaves or blacks in the North are free, but it didn't ascribe any better rights to northern black people. It just said southern blacks were freed. Also, is an economic and political instrument, not a moral altruistic move by white people of the time in general. Political because the slaves represented 3/5 of a human being. Now, I'm not going to go into it in depth here, but every 5 slaves equaled 3 persons. Thus, one slave master could carry this extra volume of voting power to Congress, and the North did not like that. Also, the North was having trouble competing economically with just the massive weight of labor power. You had the industrialization more in the North, and you had just hands-on power of the blacks in the South, and the North could not compete with that. Anyway, they just needed to break that up and get legislation and politics and economics to be more even, more standardized throughout the country. And so there was a big imbalance of procedure, resources, and things like that. Okay, not because slavery was a bad thing or something like that, something crazy like that. No, that was the minimal. It just happened to be black folks at the bottom of this thing. But this is about money, power, politics, Emancipation Proclamation, Civil War, things like that. Okay, so further moving on, let's see, we'll go 1863, you had 1861 Civil War started, 1863 Emancipation Proclamation, and the war ended in 1865. Then enters Southern Black Codes, Jim Crow laws, deprived blacks the right to vote or hold public office, and then you have great imprisonment, sentencing, and things like that. A lot of unfair treatments to blacks, and they're free now, but whites quickly adjusted the game to keep them in servitude through sharecropping, all kinds of imprisonment for not being employed, vagrancy laws, and things like that. In 1875, I wanted to put this in here, there was a civil rights law of 1875 that gave blacks equal access and rights to accommodations and transportation in 1883, that civil rights law was weakened. The Supreme Court challenged the constitutionality of the law, and my guess is, you're talking about equal accommodations, equal access to transportation, and things like that. As well, it's white folks' property. Okay, so yeah, you don't sit anywhere in the restaurant or sit anywhere on the bus. There's places they put places. There's a white fountain and a black fountain. The black fountain had tap water and stuff. The white fountains, when with electricity and compressors got small enough, the white fountain had a nice refrigerated fountain. I like the refrigerator. I like cold water too. All right. It's not a matter of taste. I'd be excluded because of my color and get probably a whole heap of trouble if I went to the white fountain or the white bathroom or sat in front of the bus and try to sleep at the inn. Right. I'm out on this road here. I got plenty of money in my pocket, but my horse is weary. I'm weary, but I can't sleep at the white inn or lodge. I gotta sleep under the stars, which ain't bad in the summertime. And finally, 1898, the grandfather clause deprived blacks of the right to vote in Louisiana. Still that voting issue, which was smart for white people. Voting, at least at that time, probably represented more power, things like that. Not so much now. I'm totally disconnected from politics. I don't get touched. Like, what's going on in the 21st century America politics, I just feel so remotely apart from it. My issues aren't being addressed. I'm not being elevated or included in the franchise. America's a business. That's why we have a president and not a monarch. The president's the president of a business. So I'm not connected with politics and all that kind of thing. Maybe someday I'll get back into it, but here's the thing: it's what Dr. Anderson wants us black folks to collectively come to, is that we need to begin voting as a block, and we need to begin communicating with each other more. There needs to be more education in the home. I got no education. I got no financial literacy. I got no political literacy. Dr. Anderson, at the end, the last chapter portion of his book, Powernomics, talks about God and the church and things like that. And you're going to find a lot of philosophical works kind of move in that direction. I'm a philosophy actually major, and some of the great works like Leviathan and some other great works, go through chapter and we talk about behavior, but then they land on spirituality and how that has a great impact on the future of people thinking, if they followed that argument to the end of the book, right? So with blacks especially, our spiritual life is in the church, so to speak. So Dr. Anderson rightly lands there, but then in my church, I got no financial literacy. I saw, we're putting money into the plate, but I'm doing it with no context. And that's what black folks in general keep doing. We're not thinking critically as a group together. We don't have our community and allegiance so much as the whites or the Asians or the Hispanics. We know how to improvise. We can create. We're very creative, extremely. We dominate in athletics, but boy, if we ever got those powers working together and moving in the same direction, then you'd see um, finally the world paying attention and looking up and taking us seriously and all that. You know, if we withdrew our support from various aspects of American activity, then you'd see some changes beginning to come. Oh boy, I'm starting to ramble here. So listen, I'm going to end there. Please meet me tomorrow. We're going to get into the northern states and how that figures for the next day or two. And then we'll just get into some other stuff, okay? But stick around, you know. Thanks for hanging out. I'm Tomlin's Nyback. That's 365 days towards racial change. Keep thinking.